So you want to catch chub, and you probably want to catch big ones too. Well, you come to the right place, because in this video I'm going to cover the main key topics of how to get the best out of your chub fishing. So welcome back to Fishing Tutorials. We made this channel to help anglers catch more fish and learn more about the species that they like to target. In the past we've covered other species in guides like this, but today's video is going to be all about chub. The first thing I'd like to talk about is where you're likely to find chub as a species. Well, they definitely prefer flowing water, whilst you can sometimes find them in lakes where they've been stocked, or on occasions you can also find them in canals. Relatively pacey, flowing water is the best place to find chub. Rivers up and down the UK hold chub. Certain watercourses with a decent amount of depth, nice amounts of cover, are places you're more likely to find them. But a river like this, which we're at today, relatively shallow, quite small, loads of snags and cover, this is a prime place to find chub. Chub are omnivorous in their feeding habits, so that means that they'll eat a wide range of foods. When they're quite small, they'll often feed on weed growth, plant matter and small bugs, little insects and things. When they get larger, they become more and more predatory, eating other fish, crayfish, and in some cases, chub have been known to eat mice and even rats when given the chance to take them. I mean, it tends to be the fact that when they get much bigger, they become more predatory. But what that means is, as an angler, you can catch chub on a range of different baits, ranging from maggots, worms, bread, spam, and even boilies and pellets and that sort of thing. Identifying a chub isn't too difficult, mostly because they've got really big mouths, probably one of the largest mouths of any UK native freshwater fish. The one species that you may sometimes be a little bit confused about is the dace. The dace looks relatively similar to a chub. The main differences being obviously the dace has got a smaller mouth, and also, as a dead giveaway, the definite way to check if you've caught a dace or a chub is check the anal fin. On a dace, the anal fin is concave, so it sort of goes inwards on itself, but on a chub, the anal fin is convex, so it sort of comes out in a more of an arc outwards away from the body. That's the main way you can be certain that you've caught a dace or a chub. When I spoke earlier about larger chub becoming more predatory, eating other small fish and crayfish and stuff like that, I mean by a large chub, 5-pounder, 4-pounder. Yes, chub do get pretty big. I think the British record is just over 9 pounds, but if you catch 3.5, 4-pound chub, you've caught a quality fish in my eyes. The distribution of chub across the United Kingdom is definitely more heavily concentrated in the Midlands and the south of the country. When you get really far north, up close to Scotland and into Scotland, you'll definitely find less chub. Chub prefer to lay their eggs and spawn in quite shallow water in fast-flowing, well-oxygenated runs. They will do this around sort of May, June time. Obviously you can't fish for them because of the river close season, but it's a great opportunity to observe the fish and see the sort of areas of the river that they like to congregate during this time. So you're on your session and you're looking for chub along your local stretch of river. The best areas to look for are areas of a medium-paced flow. In the spring and summer, when it's very warm and they're thinking about spawning, they will of course move up to very fast-flowing and very shallow water, but they don't feel so safe to spend the majority of their time in that area of the river. When you're fishing for chub, it's best to look for a medium flow, not dead slack with no movement, but also not really shallow and fast flowing. Areas like what I've got in front of me here, where there's a nice sort of walking pace area of the river with a decent amount of depth. Depth is really important when you're looking for chub, because although they'll happily spawn in, a foot of water, they'll prefer to spend the most of their year in water of at least a couple of feet deep. That's where they'll prefer to sit and feed, because they're less likely to be targeted by predators when they're hiding in slightly deeper water. When targeting chub, we are looking for similar sort of areas to where you'd likely find barbel. The main flow of the river, where there's the bottom has been gouged out and there's a decent amount of depth, is obviously key. But one thing that we've noticed is, whilst barbel like cover, they seem to prioritise well oxygenated and decent, quite fast flowing water. Chub, on the other hand, will prefer to find somewhere they can tuck themselves away in amongst some cover. So overhanging branches, snags, tree roots like going into the water, or a really substantially undercut bank is really key as well. That's somewhere that you'll always find chub. If you can find a deep margin, fast flowing up water that's like gouged out the undercut bank, that's the sort of area where you'll find the chub. So let's say you've found some chub and you want to go about trying to catch them. The first thing I would recommend is try not to scare them off. Chub can be very wary, and their eyesight, I think, is better than the eyesight of a barbel. The reason I say that is I've crept up on barbel in the past and I've stood about 1 metre away from them in shallow water, and I've dropped the bait in front of their face and they haven't got so scared off. Chub, on the other hand, if you're fishing clear water, they can be so spooky. You just cast a shadow across the water, or a stick snaps underneath your feet and they've zoomed off and they've spooked. So whilst it's not so important if the river's coloured like it is today, you know, the fish aren't going to be so spooked today because they can't see us so easily because the water's murky. But if the water in your local river is running shallow and clear, you just want to be really stealthy to avoid scaring them off. When possible in the early season or in quite warm weather, you can actually get chub feeding on the surface. Just stand upstream and just throw in little pieces of bread, little chunks of crust work perfectly, drift it down, and sometimes you'll actually see the chub start coming up and hitting that bread on the surface. This is an incredibly exciting way to catch chub, and you can actually pick out the largest fish in a shoal just by paying off line and holding the bait back when you see the smaller ones coming up for the bread. This is a really, really cool way to catch chub, but later on in the season, once other people have done it on the stretch that you fish, the chub probably are going to wise up quite quickly and become very difficult to catch off the surface. We often find there's only 1 or 2 days in the summer, early on in the season, where you can fish like this. The rest of the year, you're going to need to use a different approach. Fly fishing and lure fishing can also produce chub, and again be a very exciting way to catch them. Especially the larger chub, which are quite predatory, will chase in a small crankbait or soft plastic lure. However, just like the surface fishing with bread, conditions have to be just right. You've got to have the right clarity in the water. The chub have got to have not been fished for too much, and they just got to be really hungry if tactics like that are going to work. A more predictable and realistic way to go and catch chub consistently, whatever the conditions, is to fish with a ledger or a swim feeder. The setup that I quite like to use for chub fishing revolves around a sliding swivel on my line, and beneath that is a small weight. Sometimes I'll pinch split shot onto this little piece of line, meaning I can add and remove weight depending on the flow. For the moment, I've just got a small ledger tied on the end of there, but if I move to an area which has got less flow and I can get away with it, I'll just cut that ledger off and just pinch one small split shot on. Using the least amount of weight possible means that you're less likely to scare the fish off when you cast in, and it also helps improve bite indication. Beneath that I have a small speed bead, which means I can loop on a hook link and I can change that quite easily. If you're fishing in very shallow, clear water, it can pay to use a longer hook link, just separating your main line and your weight from your hook bait. However, with the coloured water we have today, I've gone for just over 1 foot long hook link. This hook link is made up of lines slightly lighter than the main line. That just means if I get snagged up and pull for a break, only this bit down here will break and I'll get my weights and my swivels back. On the end, I've got a small hook. The hook size depends on what bait you're using, and I'll run through different baits and hook sizes later on in this video, but this is the sort of go-to tactics, the setup that I use for most of my chub fishing. As an alternative to the link ledger setup that I just showed you, you can also just use a simple feeder rig. If you want to use a maggot feeder or a ground bait feeder, that will work great. We've actually made a video on our channel demonstrating how to tie a simple feeder rig, so we'll put a link to that video in the description down below if you want to learn how to tie a simple feeder rig. One important point of note is that with the growth in carp fishing in recent years, more and more people go fishing with hair rigs. By hair rig I mean, you know, mounting the bait underneath the hook on a little section of braid or mono. Whilst that method, using the hair rig, works incredibly well for carp because the whole hook is exposed, the hook can spin round in the fish's mouth much more easily, hair rigging is not something that I tend to use that much for chub, and there's reason for this. The way carp feed, or barbel, is by sucking. They push their gills out and suck baits right up into their mouth, and when they pick that bait up, they just suck it up and the hook goes in as well. Now, when I've watched chub feeding, they've done it quite different to this. I've watched chub pick up my hook bait, be it a piece of bread or a pellet or a boilie or something, pick it up off the bottom, literally between their lips. And when they feed like that, you're less likely to hook that chub if you're fishing with a hair rig, because there's disconnection between the bait and the hook. It's not to say that I'd never use a hair rig for chub, or that I'd tell you guys not to use a hair rig for chub. Just keep it in mind that if you're missing bites whilst chub fishing and you're using a hair rig, maybe shorten the hair right down so there's more chance of that chub getting the hook in the mouth when it picks up the bait, like with its lips. I tend to put the bait straight on the hook most of the time, and it works quite well for me. I'd also like to take a look at hook size in relation to bait size. This is something that's quite important when you're mounting your bait on the hook. I'll use a size 16 hook for a couple of maggots, a size 12 or 14 for worms, a size 10 or 8 is perfect for a chunk of bread or a bunch of worms. And finally, when I'm freelining with a big lump of bread or spam, I'll go for a size 6 hook. If you get the balance between the hook size and the bait size a little bit off, it can result in either missing bites or not getting as many bites. What I mean by that is that if you've got a big old bait and a tiny hook, you'll strike and the hook is less likely to catch hold in the fish's mouth. Conversely, if you use a small bait like a maggot and you put it on a massive hook, the fish is a lot less likely to take that because it can see the hook and it's less likely to eat it. So balancing your hook size and your bait size is very important. Another tactic that I haven't even mentioned yet is float fishing. Using a float can be really great and effective way to catch chub, but you have to have the right swim to do it in. What I mean by that is that if it's very shallow and then very deep and then very shallow again, it's not really gonna suit running the float down. You'll catch on the bottom and you'll get snagged. And then when it goes into the deeper bit, you'll be fishing too shallow. You won't be down where the fish are. The best float fishing swim has got a nice steady pace, a decent amount of depth, and a nice decent sort of length to trot that float down. As you watch the float drift down, just throwing out little pinches of maggots, hemp, like maybe some breadcrumb, is an incredible way to sort of spur those fish into feeding, draw more fish into the swim, and the natural presentation of a float running down just seems to really work. Where I'm fishing today, the river is actually a little bit small and tight for float fishing. I wouldn't really be able to get a decent run of the float down here because it would just come straight into all the snags and branches that are in front of me. Also, there isn't really a lot of depth and I would struggle to get a decent trot running through here. However, if you do want to try float fishing and it's something that you're keen on getting into, we've actually made a full float fishing tutorial on our channel. I won't run into float rigs for now because we cover it all in that video. That will also be linked down below. When we're on a float fishing session for chub, we'll often just start flicking a few maggots, bit of hemp, bread out into the swim before we even set up our kit. This gives the fish 15-20 minutes to start getting their confidence up and begin feeding more competitively before you trot the float down. That way you're more likely to catch them. This isn't something that we just do when we go float fishing, it's also something that we'll do when we're ledgering as well. Particularly when ledgering, what we'll like to do is bait up 3 or 4 different spots along a stretch. We'll just throw a little handful of bait in next to one of the trees, maybe there's an undercut, we'll throw a little handful of bait in there, and another bit a bit further downstream. Then what we'll do is we'll walk back up and fish the first swim that we baited. This way, those fish are gaining their confidence eating your loose feed without you actually sitting there fishing for them. This means that you can maximise your time and end up catching more fish. When chub fishing, I like to bring the minimum amount of tackle possible. This is because it makes me more likely to move swims, cover ground, and end up catching more fish than I would have done bringing loads of gear and sitting in one swim for the whole day. So firstly, there's the rod. My choice is to use a relatively short quiver tip rod, mostly because the majority of the rivers I fish for chub are quite small. So something like a 9 or 10 foot quiver tip rod is great. If you're fishing on larger rivers like the Severn, the Trent, the Thames, you're definitely better off going with a 12 or 13 foot rod. But for what I do, this is perfect. The important thing about the rod though is that it's got a nice, soft and sensitive quiver tip. The tip that I've got in today is 3/4 of an ounce. The reason why you want to use a lovely soft tip for chub fishing is when the fish picks up the bait in its mouth and starts to move off, you don't want it to really feel any resistance before you see a bite and set the hook. Connected to the rod, I've got my reel. This is basically any small fixed spool is fine as long as it's relatively light, because you'll be walking with this, you'll be holding it throughout the day. My reel here has got a 6 pound line on it. That's a really good, solid go-to strength to have on your reel. 6 pound is ideal for pretty much all of the chub fishing that I do. I've also got a small bag here. Within this bag, I've got the baits that I need for the day. Some spam in a little plastic bag there. I've got some bread if I want to use that as a hook bait. Also got some maggots and bits and bobs that I keep all in here as well. Also inside the bag is my spare tackle. This goes in a small pouch. Spare tackle for a session like today is not a lot of gear. You've just got some feeders, some split shot, a few spare hooks, and a bit of line in case I end up snapping up and need to retie. In here as well is a very important element, which is the bank stick. Whilst sometimes I will chub fish and just hold the rod at all times, when you're on a longer session and on a day like today, which will probably be relatively difficult, I want to put that in the ground, rest the rod on it so that I don't have to hold the rod at all times. And also, using a bank stick means that rod tip is dead still. You lay the rod down on this and your rod tip will only move if a fish takes the bait. If you're holding it, you can sometimes be like staring at that rod tip thinking it's a bite, but actually it's just you wobbling. A bank stick definitely helps when spotting bites chub fishing. As well as that, I've got a small bucket just here which has got some spare bait in it. The essentials of an unhooking mat, which I'm sitting on right now. This is quite a compact, small unhooking mat. There's no need to have a massive unhooking mat. Chub don't exactly get that big. And then lastly is my landing net. The landing net that I've got here is a small pan net variety. Lots of match anglers will use a net like this. The actual head on it doesn't matter too much, but something that you can fit any size chub in is ideal. This net here, I've had fish up to about 6 pounds, which is perfectly adequate. The important thing with your net is that you use a decent length net handle. Whilst the handle wouldn't be important for most lake fishing, lots of rivers have got quite high banks, and if you are in a swim with a steep high bank, a long landing net handle is going to really help you when landing fish. I know that I've already mentioned a few baits in this video, but I'm just going to summarise my favourite baits for chub fishing. First of all, you've got maggots. Maggots are a great go-to loose feed for chub. They're very natural looking. Chub just seem to really get competitive when feeding on them, and whether you're float fishing, scattering them around the float, or putting them into a maggot feeder, maggots are a staple, I was about to say staple diet of chub anglers, but they're not. They're a staple diet of chub. Another loose feed option is what I've got in this white bucket just here, which is a load of mashed up white bread. The night before a session, I'll take probably about half a loaf of bread, put it through the food processor. As you can see in amongst this, I've also put in a few small pellets and some crushed up boilies just to give a little bit more sustenance and scent to the bait. That's great in a feeder. It's also great if you just squeeze it into balls and throw it out into the river. It dissipates and creates a big cloud in the water. It's quite good to kick off a swim, start drawing them in. As well as the loose feeds, I've got hook baits. A great hook bait option is spam. I've chopped this up into cubes before my session. Spam works really well, especially in coloured water. The reason why is because murky water, the fish aren't hunting by sight so much, they're going by their sense of smell or taste. And an oily, really strong smelling bait like spam is great. I've also got some bread in here. Probably won't be using the bread today. I might give it a go later on, but with the colour in the water, I'm probably going to focus on worms and spam. Bread's great, especially in clear water. It's very visual. You can squeeze it into any size you want, a big piece, a little piece, and it works great for chub. The last bait I've brought with me, so I've brought quite a few, is some good old lobworms. I don't think there's a fish that swims in our rivers that doesn't eat a worm. It's a very natural bait, something that they'll find quite readily in the wild anyway, and that's a good option if everything else fails. There are of course other baits. Some people love using cheese paste. I used to use cheese paste all the time when I was younger, but I think I got sick of the smell and the amount of time it took me to make it. It's a great bait. I absolutely rate it, and I'd recommend you give it a go too, but me personally, I go with this little selection, and yeah, it does me just fine. Now there's one more bait that I forgot to mention, and that is the pellet. Pellets have boomed in popularity because loads of people go barbel fishing these days, and of course pellets are a great bait for barbel. There also happen to be a great bait for chub, especially in places where there are lots of barbel anglers. So if you fish a stretch of river that's quite regularly fished by people targeting barbel and they're throwing in loads of pellets, give a pellet a go. It's very likely to produce the big greedy chub that tend to grow pretty big and fat eating high protein baits like pellets. Now, talking of barbel, if you want to give them a go and catch a barbel for yourself, we'd definitely recommend checking out the video on screen now. It's actually on that side, which is a full in-depth guide to barbel fishing. Hope you enjoy it, and thanks for watching.